The point of today is to first provide an overview of what 108 is, what it is not, who it will affect, what are some of the basic high-level operating rules and takeaways from what we've seen thus far, and then a few nuggets of what we think as the test site will be things that will definitely be in the final rule, and what are some areas that will be, open for debate, open for comment, and then what we can do to help. And the final piece of this, definitely dedicated at the end of today's session, but feel free to ask questions throughout. The purpose of this today is us to do our public servant civic duty as state of North Dakota employees and help you understand what is quite literally a nice light read of 731 pages. I understand a lot of people have probably already thrown this into a generative AI, got a nice summary sheet, but I guarantee I have actually read all 700 pages in the last few days. It is a delightful read, but it is something that I think will be transformative for this industry and for our ecosystem here in North Dakota. So I am very happy to be here, happy to answer questions. I don't promise to know all the answers, but test me as you will, and we'll see what page numbers I can come up with. So without further ado, Part 108, if you're not aware, is really seeking to provide a clear, repeatable pathway for those beyond visualized site rules. Up until this point, and in fact, in the preamble of the NPRM, it talks about that there currently today are about 290 unique beyond visualized site operators or operations happening. And if you're one of those, the pathway from conducting your 107 operations or however you're conducting UAS operations to getting that beyond visualized sites waiver or exemption, probably difficult to say the least. Not knowing what the standards on aircraft, your operations, where to fly, how to fly, your procedures, your policies, they vary drastically between all those 290 some operations. What Part 108 really seeks to do is provide that clear, streamlined approach. There's no more guessing game. There's no more questions. It is, if you want to do beyond visualized site operations, this is the rule set you need to follow. So it's providing that clear pathway that applies to not only the operations, but also manufacturers. Manufacturers who will be, building aircraft that will be leveraged under this Part 108 rule set have to also follow Part 108 as well. So it has requirements for manufacturers in the production, design, testing, documentation, and then ultimately an airworthiness acceptance. The third category of entity that's affected by the rule is not operations or manufacturers, but a new category for the FAA, which is called the Automated Data Service Providers. New term, but essentially, if you've heard UTMs, unmanned traffic management, USS, 3PSP, or a whole host of other terms to talk about, I am an entity that's offering services or infrastructure, software or technology that supports a drone and a drone operation. You are now falling under this category of automated data service provider. So entities that are providing that, which could be separate than a manufacturer and operation, or if you are an operator and went vertical and essentially developed your own data service, you would also be falling under this new certificated part, which is Part 146. So the rule set that was proposed is wide-reaching. As I said, operators, manufacturers, and the service providers. The types of operations that 108 will apply to, you see the list up here: package delivery, including medical, agriculture, which includes the aerial applications, so spraying of pesticides or herbicides, aerial surveying, so whether it be pipeline inspection, oil line inspections, linear infrastructure, wide area infrastructure, all those fall under aerial surveying. Civic interest, also said another way, public safety. So wildfires, emergency response, disaster response, those would all fall under, could fall under a civic interest vein. Operations training. So this is separate than if I am a package delivery company and I want to train my own employees. Operations training is not meant for that. Operations training is really for if I am a flight school or if I am an entity providing, qualifications for personnel or pilots or otherwise in the beyond visual line of sight vein. There is an operations training category as well. Demonstration, which could be manufacturers conducting demonstrations of products. This could be third-party salesmen conducting demonstrations, beyond visual line of sight demonstrations of various UAS, so if they are not the manufacturer. But demonstration could also be air show or other demonstrations that are for entertainment purposes. Recreation, so acknowledging that there is right now today a prohibition on recreation flying beyond visual line of sight that would be permitted under 108 if you're following the rule set. And then the last category is flight testing. So again, something that typically applies to manufacturers, but could also apply to automated data service providers who need to, gather data and gather that evidence to prove out the safety case of whatever product, manufacturer, or payload, aircraft, or the data service. So as you look at the rule set, it has some pretty big categories of what it applies to and what it does not. In fact, if I go back real quickly, what you do not see on this list, it is the category of advanced air mobility. So flying air taxis, if there's a passenger on board, you're not going to see that permitted under Part 108. Why? In the preamble, it talks at length about a safety continuum. So the FAA looked at what was going to be permissible under Part 108 and said, hey, look, 107 is probably one of the lowest risk operations. We cap it at 55 pounds. It's below 400 feet, typically, right? It's visual line of sight for the most part. It's a low risk operation. The next kind of low risk operation that the FAA allows in the NAS is what the FAA just recently announced was Mosaic. Mosaic is the light sport aircraft rules on steroids, so 2.0. So the expanded light sport aircraft rules are also known as Mosaic. And Mosaic essentially allows a new category of aircraft and a type of operations and a lower certificated pilot to do some lower risk operations under that rule set that otherwise would not be rising to the level of like a private pilot and a fully certificated aircraft. So this was just announced probably about 4 weeks ago now that Mosaic came out. So the FAA kind of looked at Mosaic and Part 107 and said Part 108 falls squarely in between. So if you're familiar with Mosaic, it has a cap weight of 1,320 pounds. You as an aircraft, a pilot can fly that aircraft. You can carry passengers. Coincidentally, Part 108 also has that same weight cap of 1,320 pounds. However, since AAM is prohibited under Part 108, there's no people on board. It is therefore, unbiasedly, a lower risk category than Mosaic. So you have 107 down in the bottom corner of the risk continuum, low risk. Mosaic is kind of the next one up. Part 108 falls squarely in between. And so that's where you see that under Part 108, as it's proposed, would not allow advanced air mobility or air taxi type operations. So very similar to 107, 108 does say that operations are at or below 400 feet AGL in most cases. There are a few instances where above 400 feet would be permissible. For example, if you are transitioning over some very rough terrain where the terrain changes in elevation quite rapidly, so very steep terrain, temporarily exceeding 400 feet AGL would be permissible. If you are maneuvering to avoid another aircraft in the airspace, Going up to 450 feet AGL is permissible, and a few of those other edge cases like that. In 107, we see that 400 feet is a waiverable reg. So a lot of operations have gotten waiver in 107 above 400 feet. In the proposed rule set that is 108, there is not a list of regulations that are subject to waiver yet. A lot of times we see that in the final rule, but this one could be one that is maybe waiverable, or altitudes above 400 feet might be allowed. However, there's not a lot of justification in the preamble to really indicate that the FAA is or is not thinking that 108 will apply above 400 feet. So that is an unknown for if, 500 feet, 1,000 feet or higher altitudes would be allowed under that rule set. What is apparent throughout the rule set, though, is that there is a drastic increase in FAA oversight and approval process. So while the rule set is out there, you don't need a waiver or a COA, so you don't have to go through that process of the FAA. There is a lot of oversight on an operation, an operator, a manufacturer, and a service provider. And you see that all the way down to if an operator is seeking to operate under this rule set, having FAA approved not only procedures and process and a certificate, but also where you're going to fly, what routes you're going to fly. So takeoff and landing locations, whose personnel are authorized to conduct those operations. All of those are mandatory FAA approval requirements of Part 108. Also for 108 operations, we see the new terms of strategic deconfliction and conformance monitoring. If you've been in the UTM space, these are probably not that new of terms, but it's the first time the FAA is really codifying these into rules. So strategic deconfliction is something that happens on pre-flight. So before I go up flying, I'm going to either engage through a software or right within my drone, something that's going to indicate, not only for myself, but to other users of the NAS, where I intend to fly on pre-flight, right? And this is referred to as an operational intent volume. So whether it's a box or it's a 3D geographic area, I map out that operational intent volume, submit that in, that's shared with other users of the NAS, and then deconflicted, right? Strategic deconfliction. To ensure that no one else is planning to fly in that same airspace at the same time as I want to fly. Then, once I am flying under that operational intent volume, once I am en route and flying on that plan, if I deviate from that, I need to have some sort of conformance monitoring. So if I go outside my little bubble, it's not only going to alert me of, whoa, I went outside my bubble, but also it's going to alert other airspace users in that vicinity that someone that's flying in this airspace is not adhering to their operational intent volume. So strategic deconfliction and conformance monitoring are now minimum requirements for all operations under 108. In addition to that, if I am flying in airspace that is higher level controlled, so class Bravos and Charlie airspace, in more congested airspace, so in and around airports, and higher population densities, which FAA refers to in category 5. If I'm flying in those areas, I also, in addition to strategic deconfliction and conformance monitoring, have to have detect and avoid. So some means to ensure that I am able to detect both cooperative and non-cooperative airspace users. So whether that be UAS and manned traffic. So that means if I am a traditional pilot flying around, don't have a transponder, don't have ADS-B, and I'm totally entitled to do that. In those certain classes of airspace and population densities, the UAS has to be able to detect that I'm flying around in that airspace. No questions so far? Okay. tried to come up with some sort of picture to break this all down. There's a lot of different rules in 108. Overarching, there is a new operating rule set. So up until this point, we've had either I get to fly under 107 or I get to fly under Part 91. This does introduce a new operating rule set, flying under Part 108. So now we, as a UAS operator, have essentially 3 different flight rules that we can elect to operate under. They're not interchangeable. I can't go like, now I'm flying under 91 and halfway through the flight, I'm going to fly under 107. It doesn't work that way. You pick which rules of the air you want to fly by. But Part 108 does introduce new rules of the air. In order to fly under those rules of the air, though, I have to have, as an operator, an operating permit or certificate. That changes from what we expected to see in the rule. So rewind a year ago, the best guess, and based upon the BVLOS ARC recommendations, we were anticipating to see a new rating on your remote pilot license. So right now, if you have a remote pilot, if you have a remote pilot license, if you flip it over on the back, it says small UAS rating. A lot of people don't even see that. They just say, hey, you got a remote pilot license. But on the back, it actually has a rating that says small UAS rating. We anticipated that we would also see a new rating that would say BVLOS, or Beyond Visual Line of Sight rating. It's not the case. Part 108 does not introduce any new pilot requirements. It does, though, put all the onus on the operator. So that would be a company, an entity. It could be a single person. It's very difficult to meet the requirements of such, but it could be a single person operation. But it is on the entity, the operator, to meet the requirements as per their operating permit or their operating certificate. And generally speaking, a permit is easier to achieve, but it'll only get you privileges to fly in lower risk airspace, lower risk environments. We'll have some confinement on weight or scale of your operations. You can't fly, you can't have a fleet of 200 aircraft. You might be limited to a fleet of 25 or 100 or whatever, based upon your operating permit. Operation or an operating certificate would be wider. So I have applicability in more congested airspace, more complex airspace, higher population densities, less of those restrictions on the aircraft weight or number of aircraft that my company can operate. But in order to get that operating certificate, I have to have a little bit more rigor to my company, a little bit higher maturity in order to get that operating certificate. For either an operating permit or an operating certificate, there's kind of 3 categories of things that I need to submit in my application and essentially, prove to the FAA in order to get a permit or certificate. First being personnel. So as I said, no new pilot requirements. However, it does introduce 2 new personnel terms. The first being an operations supervisor, the second being a flight coordinator. Operations supervisor is intended to kind of oversee the operations and compliance for the company, and a flight coordinator is kind of like the new pilot. Okay, it's acknowledging that as autonomy and AI have gotten more and more advanced with these UAS systems, the word pilot isn't quite appropriate anymore, because the stick skills or that a traditional pilot would have might not be appropriate, right? You might not have, for a particular aircraft design, you might not have a human in the loop, on the loop, and outside of the loop, however. And so really it is the role of a flight coordinator that is overseeing whatever level of autonomy that drone has. So they still have the ability to intervene and execute decisions for the safety of flight, but it's probably not the same level of intervention that a traditional pilot or what we think a pilot has up until this point. So the FAA elected to use the term flight coordinator. The second category of things that you have to really prove out with a permit or certificate is the airworthiness of the aircraft. And most of this onus is on the manufacturer. So yes, an airworthiness certificate is not required for Part 108. However, airworthiness acceptance is. And it is not quite as difficult as an airworthiness certificate, but don't think it's as easy as 107. So in order for a manufacturer to get an airworthiness acceptance, they have to have, first and foremost, the procedures for airworthiness acceptance. So conformance to industry accepted standards, building out their internal quality management, quality control processes and procedure, cybersecurity, data management, all those are requirements that a manufacturer must have in place. In addition, they'll have to go through design and testing requirements, all of that as a prerequisite to actually submit in to the FAA to get that airworthiness acceptance for a particular aircraft. But then also on the operator, once I buy a particular aircraft that has an airworthiness acceptance under Part 108, I'm not just good to go either. I have to adhere to and cannot deviate from the manufacturer's guidelines on the design, the performance, maintenance, alterations, etc. It's very akin to light sport aircraft, with the exception of rather than getting experimental cert at the end of that, it's an airworthiness acceptance. And then the third category is really the procedures. And the procedures do change between an operating permit and an operating certificate, but both do have the baseline, which you'll see kind of, if you note the difference in the bullets, the cybersecurity and data management. That's a minimum requirement for both, whether it's an operating permit or an operating certificate. But operation certificate, then getting more privileges, I have to prove out a higher level of maturity and rigor to the FAA. So training program, validation tests, communication assessment. I mean, C2. So when I do an operation, I have to have an entire C2 analysis of that flight to ensure that I am going to be able to maintain my link integrity for the planned flight operation. Ground risk assessment, which it actually points to land scan data, but not only just terrain obstacles, but then in addition to population densities, taking that into account in my ground risk assessment. A SMS system that aligns to Part 5, so SMS that aligns to traditional aviation and the construct of SMS that we see there. Inoperative equipment. So something's probably going to break on my UAS at some point, no matter how well it's designed. So I have to have essentially a minimum equipment list, said another way. And so for those that come from traditional aviation know exactly what that means. But minimum equipment list meaning of, okay, if something isn't operative, what's acceptable to be inoperative and what's not acceptable to be inoperative? And if it is acceptable, how do I activate, placard, and still continue the operation in a safe way? And for how long can I do that? That's all requirements in the inoperative equipment procedures. And then lastly, anything that would be like the type of certificate appropriate. And by type of certificate, I don't mean type certificate. I mean the type of operations I'm proposing. If I'm going to apply for a package delivery, I would have to have package handling and hazardous material type procedures in place. If I am, doing aerial application, spraying pesticides or herbicides, I would have to have those procedures in place as appropriate. So all of those things, prerequisites to go into my application package to go in to get an operations permit or an operations certificate. Yes.
How do you get the grades like this?
The operator.
Oh, yeah.
So you can leverage a lot of the manufacturer's guidance and operating limitations. In fact, the operator could also do it, but essentially it is now onus on either manufacturer or operator to meet that requirement. Okay, so if we think back to the other side, the top box in there was the operating rules. So operating rules, first and foremost, aircraft requirements to the max weight that we see within Part 108 is 1,320 pounds. As I said before, that kind of aligns to what we see in light sport standards. So wasn't a surprise to see that that was the weight requirement. There is no traditional airworthiness certificate. However, hopefully beat it to death that airworthiness acceptance is a replacement to that and is still kind of equally hard to get and achieve. Operations over people is allowed under Part 108, but is not blanket allowed. So in the NPRM, the FAA actually proposes 5 different categories, category 1 through category 5, of different population densities that would be acceptable. And so it essentially starts putting in caps on those different privileges. As I said before, those permits are for lesser risk operations, so they may only be permissible in categories 1, 2, or 3 type population densities. If I want to fly in higher population densities, probably going to need an operating certificate, higher level of rigor. Those 5 categories are based upon land scan data, so it breaks it down in there of like 30 arc second by 30 arc second square, which is about 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, and that's how population density is categorized. So if I am limited to, say, category 2 or less, through that data, I would have to essentially plot my route of flight based upon the little squares that would have the appropriate population densities. What is prohibited in the rule, though, is still flight over large gatherings of people, open air assemblies. So this would be stadiums, concerts, outside gatherings, because it's recognizing that those population densities and the concentration of people are largely unprotected, so unsheltered, and therefore really are a increased level of risk. And the rule really didn't handle how those operations could occur safely, and so ultimately just prohibited those from occurring. Next operational role is, operational roles within the operating rules. It talks about 2 different roles, the operations supervisor and the flight coordinator. As I said, no new pilot requirements. That was kind of a shock, but what you see is an operations supervisor, which is the person that would be responsible for compliance for an operating permit or an operating certificate. So if you are a company, you have an operating permit or an operating certificate, you would likely have an operations supervisor that then would be responsible for ensuring that all the operations that are being conducted under that permit or certificate adhere to the provisions of that permit or certificate. The flight coordinator, of which you might have many, the flight coordinator is the one that's directly overseeing the UAS flight. Now, it could be in a 1-to-1 fashion where it's one flight coordinator for one aircraft, or the rule does actually keep it open that a flight coordinator could oversee multiple aircraft operations. All goes back to what do you, as a operator, put in your application for permit or certificate. But ultimately, is that flight coordinator that could, based upon the level of autonomy, intervene for safety of the flight. Again, deviating from pilot, going more to the flight coordinator, some of that is maybe more human on the loop versus human in the loop, although it could still be in. Safe separation and right of way. Probably the most controversial change proposed in the rule set, but not unanticipated if you were following the BVLOS ARC and some of those recommendations. So I talked about this new term, automated data service providers, ADSPs, that they would be leveraged for airspace deconfliction, whether it be strategic deconfliction, conformance monitoring, and or detect and avoid. Any or all of the above. And as an entity, you could should say as an operator, you could leverage one or multiple automated data service providers to meet your operational intent. But in addition to that, in order to have the rule set allow for a technical means of airspace integration, there is a proposed amendment to Part 91 as well. It's a change to 91.113, which are the right-of-way rules for all airspace users. In that proposed change, it states that manned aircraft would have to yield below 400 feet to other aircraft that are broadcasting their position. Or said another way, UAS operating under Part 108 would have the right-of-way below 400 feet over aircraft who are not broadcasting their position via ADS-B or electronic conspicuity. Well, even more simple, because it's a new topic. If I'm a drone flying under 108 below 400 feet in a low congested airspace, so like most of North Dakota, out in the rural areas, I would have the right of way as a UAS operator over, say, a crop duster who is not broadcasting ADS-B. You look shocked. Now, let me pause. This is a section of the NPRM that went into a lot of detail on how you could propose this thing. And I will say, as being on the BVLOS arc, this conversation became a very much a manned versus unmanned debate. So that is just not true. And I think the FAA did a really great job. And I would recommend people read this particular section of the preamble to understand the FAA's mentality in this. Since ADS-B was mandated in 2020 and kind of grandfathered in, there's a lot of data that is showing that ADS-B did increase the safety of the national airspace. So from an equipage standpoint, that technology really enhanced safety of airspace users. UAS agnostic, right? It's just saying, look, traditional aviation, you had a benefit. Technology advanced, and so ADS-B has really helped increase the safety of your operations. It just so happens that advancing that a little bit further forward, and again, low altitude airspace below 400 feet, non-congested, away from airports, and low population densities. If we look at expanding that rule set just a little bit further, we are going to increase the safety of those airspace operations, period. That's first and foremost, is we're increasing the safety of the NAS. Man to man, man to unmanned, doesn't matter, all airspace users. As a secondary effect, it just so happens we're also allowing a new entrant, meaning UAS. By changing this requirement, it really does allow UAS to operate in that airspace safely, because we've enhanced the safety of it regardless. And again, I'm not going to do it justice. I would really encourage people to read that section in the preamble, but that's where it stems from. So it shouldn't be a shock that this is something that UAS is taking away a privilege from traditional aviation. It's we as a nation are enhancing the safety of operations that are being conducted in that airspace. And it just so happens it also helps UAS. Security requirements. If there was one area of the NPRM I would place money on that's not going away, is the security requirements. From a personnel from both an operator and manufacturer do have to go through at least some level of a TSA security threat assessment, which means a background check of sorts. Okay, so that hasn't been something that UAS has seen before. However, traditional aviation does have that. In addition to that, the requirement for cybersecurity policy procedures, and data management procedures is a minimum requirement, not just for operators, whether it's an operating permit or certificate. It's also a requirement for manufacturers, and it's a requirement for automated data service providers. So like I said, if there's one area I don't think that is going away, is the increased security and cybersecurity requirements of this rule, because it literally touches every aspect: personnel, operator, manufacturer, and ADSP. So if you are someone in this space, in any of those roles that right now today does not have cybersecurity policies and procedures in place or data management procedures in place, I would go up and say it's a worthwhile investment to start looking at how you encompass that into your operations in your company. Because I do think that is going to be a requirement under Part 108. So if all those fall in that top box of the operating rules, the very last requirement within the operating rules is if you want to take advantage of all these wonderful new privileges that are Part 108, you have to have an operating permit or certificate. So that's a minimum requirement to do any of the operations under 108. Any other questions thus far? Doing good? Yeah.
What are the UAS broadcast requirements?
Great question. So they have to have standard remote ID as well as interoperability in certain types of airspace environments. So when you get into class Bravos and Charlies, that ADSB or that other electronic conspicuity, which has a couple of different proposed pathways for that, is a requirement to kind of broadcast your UA position as well. But standard remote ID is like the baseline. Anything else so far? Okay, a lot of words on the slide. I'm going to kind of take a second to go into operating permit, certificate, and then I think we'll get to blanking, airworthiness acceptance, and then finally the Part 146, the automated data service provider. So I said before that the main difference, if you take anything away from today, is permit versus certificate. Permit are intended to be for those lower risk BVLOS operations. So they might be limited in scope, scale, and weight of aircraft. And then certificates are for those higher risk BVLOS operations. So in complex environments, higher density population densities, higher weight categories, higher scalability, and higher scope of operations. And you can see that then from the eligibility requirements, risk level, approval process, or oversight scales based upon a permit versus certificate. I'll jump down to SMS, so safety management systems and training. The difference is there, right? So under an operating permit, SMS is not required. And the training expectations, so my personnel training, is just some basic training expectations. Now, the rule set calls out what are expected to be part of your training program, but it's pretty basic. And I would say it mirrors a lot of the same knowledge requirements that you see under 107. Airspace, weather, aeronautical decision making, strategic deconfliction and conformance monitoring are in there, et cetera. But if you want to do all that is the wonderful and great under Part 108, you have an operating certificate. And operating certificate, again, SMS and training, you see SMS is required, and that there has to be a comprehensive training program, which also has to be FAA approved. It's part of that prerequisite to go in and get that operating certificate. And once that you apply for that certificate, that program is essentially, your own training program is an FAA approved training program. And so deviation from that or election not to adhere to that is not an option, right? For you to adhere to your operating certificate, you have to adhere to your training program that you put on paper. As some examples. If I were to do a main takeaway from this, regardless of whether it's a permit or a certificate, the documentation that you see required for all Part 108 operations is going to be a drastic change from 107. So from a flight logs, maintenance logs, alterations, personnel records, as I said, the cybersecurity aspect of things. So if you have any of those different vulnerabilities or interference on your C2, the documentation, recording, and reporting to the FAA is going to be much different than what you would experience under 107 operations today. However, if you are well versed in Part 135 or Part 121 in a traditional sense, you're going to see the direct traceability from these requirements to those. And so it really is something that is akin to a traditional air carrier operation. We as the UAS industry are getting a lot of those privileges that, Part 135 and Part 121, those traditional air carriers get today. And to get those privileges, we have to adhere to something that looks a lot more like their minimum requirements, which includes the documentation, reporting, and records. Airworthiness acceptance. So second box on that chart, right? So is the airworthiness acceptance piece. And a lot of this onus is on the manufacturers. Now, it was a challenge for the BVLOS ARC at the time to really write some really strict standards on, hey, how do we design requirements in rule that are future-proof? Because we knew at the time in the BVLOS ARC that we were trying to come up with airworthiness requirements for aircraft that weren't even conceptualized yet, which was a huge challenge. So this airworthiness acceptance, which again is very akin to light sport aircraft, is something that we think will be a little bit future-proof. It has some basic fundamental steps of the process that the burden is on the manufacturer. However, that means then that the rule set will be, a solid enough foundation to not prohibit new types of aircraft design from coming out and from being invented. So first and foremost is the design and development. And so on the manufacturer, if I am seeking airworthiness acceptance, which is a minimum requirement for any operator that is going to conduct operations under Part 108, the aircraft has to have an airworthiness acceptance. The design and development probably follows industry consensus standards or some sort of means of compliance. So I could write my own means of compliance, but leveraging industry consensus standards and those safety standards in order to do so. That could be traditional industry consensus standards. You can leverage some of the light sport design standards that are out there, or what we're anticipating to see is a whole influx of new standards, design standards that come out specific for UAS. So once I design and develop my aircraft, I still have a lot of testing and validation. So I can't just say, hey, I've developed a prototype of one. Nope, there is requirements on the testing and validation. So conducting the flight testing, gathering that data, and then using that data to compare or build your documentation. So your compliance documentation, your procedures, your operating limitations, and your configuration control. All of that documentation then rolls up into your FAA acceptance package, which then the FAA reviews, approves, and ultimately then issues your airworthiness acceptance. But airworthiness acceptance shouldn't be viewed as something that is one and done. There is ongoing conformance and monitoring that has to occur, as well as the aircraft are then bound to operate in the confines of those manufacturer limitations. So this is one part of the NPRM I did find that was interesting. There's not a speed limit in here. There's not a weather limit in here. You don't see those as part of the operation rules. What you do see is weather limits are as per manufacturer guidance. Speed limits as per manufacturer operating limits. That's what you see instead. So there may be an aircraft that, I don't know, their max speed is 5 knots. And for that aircraft operating under that operating permit, that is truly their max speed. Doesn't matter if it can go 10 knots, 50 knots, 100 knots. That is what their limitation is by under the operating rule. Yeah.
So would the upward bound for airspeed still be under Part 91 then?
No, There is, so when you're fully under 108, you're under 108. The upper airspeed limit, is it still under going to Part 91, which would be 200 knots or 250 knots, depending upon altitude. There's a really interesting proposed rule in here, which I would encourage people to comment on, because it goes back to the manufacturer. It says, hey, manufacturer, if you're developing an aircraft, that aircraft cannot exceed 87 knots ground speed, which is a really big challenge, I think. I understand why the FAA proposed it. They have the justification on it, but they're actively seeking comments on that. So there is an upper bound limitation for a manufacturer not to invent and get an airworthiness acceptance for an aircraft that has a max speed greater than 87 knots ground speed. Yeah. It's 87 knots, 100 miles per hour. Yes, but it's air, not ground. That's the differences. So, and going back to my teaching a private pilot ground school day, ground speed is a challenge, because if I am flying, granted 400 feet, I'm probably not having that big of a tailwind. But let's just say I'm flying at 50 knots, but I have a 50 knot tailwind. My ground speed very quickly is 100 knots. Great. Now I'm exceeding my manufacturer limitations, and now I'm exceeding the permissible operating limits of Part 108, just because of wind. So comment on that if you're equally confused as I am. Yeah, and then there's also the ongoing compliance. So just because you have an airworthiness acceptance, gathering data back from the operations that are being conducted. So if you sell 50 of these aircraft out there, continue to gather the data back on those aircraft, and then providing that back as the continued operational safety of your aircraft design is a requirement under Part 108 as well. Good so far? Get there? Yeah.
Control, and the big issue in terms of they wanted a configuration lock, but technology changes and gets better. So if you wanted to upgrade, then all of a sudden you have to start over or look for amendments. Did that change the program?
Yes and no. It's proposed that it's a little bit more flexible. It's not 100% locked down where you're restarting over. However, it may require an amendment to your airworthiness acceptance. You can also, as it reads, have some configurations that are maybe modifiable that would be allowable within your airworthiness acceptance. So I don't know if it's like different payload packages, a LiDAR versus a box to carry packages, and they're swappable. Those could all essentially be possibly permitted under the same airworthiness acceptance for the aircraft, based upon the aircraft's documentation that is provided as part of that acceptance package. The area that is a little bit more open is on the software. So it has more aspects on the data management, software versioning, and some different, kind of acknowledgements that minor changes or patches would be acceptable, but full major changes would require some additional documentation. Not a reset, but some documentation that would have to go back to the FAA. Yes, sorry, I will next time. Last category, which is actually very interesting, because it's, even though we're dubbing this the Part 108 NPRM, that also introduces Part 146. So Part 146 is for automated data service providers. And I think this will honestly revolutionize a lot of the UAS industry. Up until this point, if you were a service provider, UTM, USS, 3PSP, your service had no way to really get certified, acknowledged, approved by the FAA agnostic of a very specific operator. The only way, and I'll call out Vantis on this, the only way Vantis really could get acknowledged and accepted by the FAA is when an operator went in and petitioned for a waiver or an exemption to do their operations. About 2-ish years ago, the FAA started to gather some data on how would they certificate service providers by introducing a new program that was called the Near-Term Approval Process, NTAP. And so service providers were actually accepted into that program, completed the 4 phases, and then were issued a letter of authorization at the end. Vantis was one of them. Wing and Zipline were also 2 others that received LOAs through that process. But that now is replaced by a new Part 146 rule. This is a huge opportunity for service providers to be certified independent of an operator or an operation. The service provider aspect of things is any automated service that could contribute to a beyond visual line of sight. So it could be a weather service. It could be a strategic deconfliction. It could be DAA. All of those would be services that could be then certified under Part 146. But for an operation under 108 to leverage a service that provides detect and avoid, deconfliction services, or conformance monitoring, that service must be certified under Part 146. So this is really going to, just like probably 108 operations and manufacturers, separate, immature from mature operators. You're going to see this in the service provider aspect as well. But there's going to be a lot of entities that have been operating these services that will not be able to meet the Part 146 proposed requirements unless they really increase the maturity and the robustness of their organization. So the requirements to become an automated data service provider is, first and foremost, again, a theme, adhering to industry consensus standards and those interoperability standards, so that we have to talk to other services that are out there. They have to implement quality management systems, cybersecurity policy and procedures, data management procedures, change management procedures, software versioning control, and then conduct operational and test verification and validation of all their different services, as well as versionings of their service moving forward. So there's a lot of rigor, a lot of operational maturity that is required to now offer a service provider. But at the end, you also have to allow that FAA oversight and validation of that service before it can be offered and essentially certificated under Part 146. If I have any comment on 146, it is for anyone that had said that Vantis was over-engineered and overly robust, 146 just proves them wrong. I would say today, Vantis currently hits 90 to 95% of the requirements that are proposed in 146, which is a huge relief off of our team's shoulders. But it really illustrates the level of rigor that the other service providers in this area will have to overcome in order to become certificated under Part 146.
So Wing and Zipline don't get automatically grandfathered in?
No one does.
So yes.
Yes.
Good.
Yep. Shoot, I had another comment there. Sorry, he asked if Wing and Zipline automatically got grandfathered in, and the answer is no. Not even Vantis gets automatically grandfathered in. Everyone was going to have to get certificated under Part 146. The other interesting aspect of Part 146 that I think is really precedent setting is it has 3 different service levels within this part. Service level 1 is, or I should say service level 1 and 2 talk about offering services for operations that are being conducted under Part 108. Service level 3, which has more robust requirements, is for services that are being offered for operations that occur under other rule sets. Could be 107, and even though the NPRM doesn't call it out specifically, I feel it's alluding to operations under Part 91. So as a service provider, I'm not just limited in scope to 108. 146 is a larger aperture. It says, hey, if you want to offer, say, detect and avoid services, and you want to offer those to 108 operations, you only have to meet levels 1 or 2. But if you want to offer detect and avoid services to other airspace users that are operating under, say, Part 91, you have to meet level 3. So it's a big incentive for service providers because it opens up their market, right? That my market as in developing a service and a product isn't just those operations under 108. 146 also expands to helping operations and UAS operations under Part 91 as well. So that's quite an interesting point.
You said before, you said regarding how many people they thought the FAA thought was going to come Part 1. How many Part 146?
Great question. So it cites 2 letters of acceptance, and our team was actually discussing this earlier. We are aware of 3 letters of acceptance the FAA has issued, that being to Wing, Zipline, and to Vantas. We don't know if there's any others, but that is what it calls out in the end part of, at least now today, they only cite 3. Now, there are other entities in this space, but they have not received a letter of acceptance.
The letter of acceptance isn't the first. Going forward, it won't be the first step in 146.
No, it will not be. It just indicates who are the entities that have been in the space that have gone through that rigor with at least the FAA. It's not to say others don't have this operational maturity or the rigor within their service provider, entities. It's the only ones the FAA has acknowledged thus far today. So where we're at today. The lovely 731 pages dropped August 7th officially. So next steps in the process. 1, read the NPRM. I've pulled out a couple spots where I think it'd be really worth reading if you're not going to read all 700 pages. But you're highly encouraged to submit your comments. Comments are due October 6th. If you scan the QR code, that will take you right to the NPRM that's on regulations.gov, which is also where you'd officially submit your comments. When you're submitting your comments, if you've never done this before, the more solution orientated that you can be, the more data driven, the better the comment's going to be. It's really going to provide information that will help the FAA make an informed rule. I'd also add, don't just add the areas of the NPRM that you're unhappy with. Add the areas that you're happy with. Because if there's areas where you go, wow, this is great, the FAA knocked it out of the park, they should not change this. This as a proposed rule should go right to final rule. Add that in the comments as well. Because if they don't have that comment out there, they don't know, right? The FAA doesn't know. So it's equally important to not only, complain about areas that you feel are unfit, but also reinforce those areas that are good proposed rules. So that way we have those out there and the FAA has those records in the comments to support their final rulemaking decision. With that, other questions, anything? Many, go first.
Part 146 was tied to the same time when this part of the rule.
Correct. Part 108 and 146 came out in the same NPRM. There are a few others, and so like I said, the changes to Part 91 are also in here. Changes to Part 47, fun fact. So if you're registering an aircraft under 108, registration via drone zone will no longer be a thing. You'll have to register as a full N number aircraft. So there's changes to Part 47. There's also changes to some of the TSA regulations because there is the additional requirement on the security threat assessment. But all of those are under the same NPRM.
There is
This affect any current loss? They have to come up with this.
Great question. So the question was, does this affect any of the current BVLOS operations, or do they have to go through the requirements of Part 108? And so the FAA does call that out. The FAA calls out that there's currently, like I said, 290 unique operators that are operating BVLOS under a waiver or exemption today. And it says that those operations are expected to continue until the expiration of their waiver or exemption, in which case they anticipate a large majority of them then moving under Part 108. That said, some of those waivers and exemptions may be operations that are being conducted under Part 91, and those operations may continue. Part 108 may not be the rule set for them because they're either at higher altitudes or different airspaces or for different operational privileges and operations, that Part 91 might still be the rule set for them to continue. But by and large, the FAA cites that they anticipate most of those that are doing BVLOS operations today to continue their operations under waiver and exemption until their waivers and exemptions expire, in which case they would transition over to Part 108. Yeah. Yes.
Mentioned that philosophical drop. Is really
Great question. So the question for those online was, light sport aircraft has repairmen certificates for those that are authorized to operate and conduct maintenance on light sport aircraft. And so does 108 have anything similar if it's drawing from those light sport and mosaic rules? The answer is no, there's not a repairman certificate required under Part 108. However, just as we said with the speed and some of those weather limitations, an aircraft manufacturer would prescribe what skills and knowledge a person would need to have in order to conduct a particular set of even repairs, maintenance, and alterations to an aircraft that receives an airworthiness acceptance. So I would take that to say a manufacturer could say, Joe just has to meet A, B, C, D, E in a skills and knowledge requirement, and he is authorized to conduct 100% of the maintenance, repairs, and alterations on the aircraft. Or a manufacturer may come out and say, Joe has to do A, B, C, D, E in a skills and knowledge, but they still can only do preventative maintenance or a certain set of alterations. Anything above and beyond that, major alterations, major repairs, would have to go back to the manufacturer. The onus, again, is on the manufacturer to distinguish that. And then for those that are flying, so operator permit or operator certificate has to adhere to those manufacturer operating limitations. Follow on?
So we're talking about the non-intensive. Mentions budget for minor space. How do you do that?
Great question. So it was talking on automated data service providers and that operational intent volume. How big of an airspace could that be? It doesn't confine it. All it says is that there's interoperability requirements that when an operator, again, either directly or through a automated data service provider selects an operational intent volume, that is shared with the other airspace users within that area and within that vicinity. But it doesn't say how small or how large it's permissible to be.
It's asked, aircraft, no.
Yep.
No issue. Question that how is regardless of what the department else is there any federal oversight for what that happens?
Great question. So the question was on if there's two operational intent volumes that go in for the same geographic area and four-dimensional in the same time period, right? So not deconflicting via time, who gets priority, right? And let's assume they all hit submit right at the same nanosecond, so they went into the queue at the same time. The FAA has not come out and said who gets priority in that case. In fact, it defers to industry consensus standards to develop interoperability and essentially self-governance in that space. Looking to those standards bodies to help define, what would be the priority. If one of those two entities is civic interest, do they get priority over package delivery? Could be. There again, FAA at this point is deferring to industry consensus standards to propose what does the UAS community want to do within those airspaces, which is going to be complex. It is specifically an area that is discussed in the preamble of acknowledging the difficulty of self-governance among UAS users and seeking comments specifically on whether or not the industry and the public feels that is a good or not so good approach. Victor?
A single aircraft able to operate between 107 by BVLOS for one mission group 7 and BVLOS for a different mission group.
Okay, so I'll repeat real quick for those. So can a operation aircraft pilot fly visual line of sight under 107 and fly BVLOS under 108? So also part in the preamble that is directly addressed by the FAA, because they say, yeah, we acknowledge that everything that we're talking about within Part 108 is talking BVLOS. We don't specifically acknowledge that visual line of sight operations could happen under 108. And they said they elected to take that approach because of what they anticipate is that the burden of operational proof and everything else is much lesser under 107. So if someone is thinking about efficiency and ease of operations, if they're going to do a visual line of sight operation, they're probably going to default to 107 naturally. However, that does not prohibit visual line of sight flights from happening under 108. But if they are conducting visual line of sight operations under 108, they'll have to meet all the other requirements, meaning the airworthiness acceptance, operating permit, operating certificate, the operational flight rules, et cetera. So to directly answer the question, yes, an entity, so I'm an operator, could conduct operations one day with a particular aircraft under 107, and the next day or even later that day conduct an operation under 108. But I would still have to adhere to all the requirements of that particular flight rule. So whether it be 107 or 108. Big. Yeah, so the question is, are there enough ADSPs, automatic data service providers, to support Part 108? And like I said, the FAA points to the 2 and even 3 letters of authorization that have been issued through the NTAP program. But I would say, I won't speak for the FAA, but from our experiences, there are other service providers that are in that industry and in that space now. They have some maturity to do in order to meet the proposed requirements of 146, but that will be a critical, expansion of the UAS industry in order to support the 108 operations. What I will say the FAA talks about in the end is once final rule comes, which if you heard earlier, there's speculation whether that's as soon as, like 6 months from now, or if it's probably a year plus from now. But final rule comes out, how quickly do we actually anticipate adoption of the final rule? And the FAA anticipates that'll actually occur over the next 3 years beyond that. So I think that highlights that there's an opportunity for, if there are not ADSPs, automated data service providers today, a year from now, there should be a few more. And then 3 years from now, as the adoption of 108 takes foot in the industry, hopefully there are even more that come and play in that market space. Other questions? Okay, so with that said, we're here to help. There's a lot to digest. This was intended to be an overview and an introduction. Unfortunately, 60 days goes really fast. So if you have questions and need help on, engaging as you're starting to build either your own personal or your company's perspective and comments into the NPRM, we're here to provide context, whether it be from the BVLOS ARC perspective, our experience as a test site, definitely here to help in that vein. But then after even the comment period is ending, if you're one of those entities that is falling somewhere within this Part 108 category, whether that be an operator, a manufacturer, or an automated data service provider, and want to help start positioning yourselves to be compliant, to start keeping a listening ear to the ground of, hey, where's the FAA going from NPRM to final rule? We're going to be best suited working with the FAA day in, day out to kind of keep apprised of what those changes may or may not be and help position you to be successful for when final rule does come out. What we have heard from the FAA, which is similar to when 107 came out, is there is a sentiment to have waivers ahead of rule. So within 107, when the NPRM came out to final rule, it was actually longer than what we're anticipating for 108. There were a lot of waivers, Section 333 operational waivers, that started allowing operational entities to be conducting what became 107 operations before the final rule came out. The FAA has said that is their intent to take that same approach and that same strategy with Part 108, approving operations ahead of rule, so waivers ahead of rule. And we want to help get there. We want to help position North Dakota in this ecosystem, which is already very well suited for a 108. We want to help position us for when 108 gets finalized, that we're seamlessly ready to go. So here to help, reach out. Contact information is up on the slide that directs to the website. You can fill out the form there. If you have any of our contact information, everyone on our team is ready to help ingest, because we know how revolutionary this was when 107 came out. And so we're now all hands on deck for 108 as well. So with that, thank you. Close the line. Thank you.